Flowers arrived, speeches were planned. My funeral was nothing but a cold-blooded business transaction. A stage where my mother declared me dead just to hand my grandfather's millions to my sister. They thought I was a memory. They thought Natalie Sterling was finally erased. But they forgot that some ghosts don't stay buried. They wait for the perfect moment to strike. To understand how I ended up at my own burial in a blood-red dress, you have to go back to the day the sky turned black. The rain in Greenwich doesn't just fall, it colonizes. It's a relentless gray weight that turns the vibrant autumn gold of Connecticut into something sodden and grieving. Standing by the window of the third-floor master suite, I watched the water streak down the glass, blurring the manicured hedges of the Sterling estate until they looked like jagged teeth. Behind me, the steady rhythmic beep of a heart monitor acted as a metronome for a dying dynasty. I sat in the velvet armchair, my fingers intertwined with my grandfather's frail, age-spotted hand. His skin felt like ancient parchment, translucent and cooling. I wasn't just watching him die, I was guarding the only person who had ever truly seen me for who I was, rather than what I cost. In this dim, clinical room, the air smelled of antiseptic and forgotten memories, a sharp contrast to the rest of the house. Through the heavy oak doors, the muffled, sharp voices of my mother, Sante, and my sister Valora drifted in from the hallway. They weren't discussing hospice care or the comfort of a dying man. Their words were brittle and bright, clinking like ice in a cocktail glass as they debated the vintage of the wine for the celebration of life they were already planning. To them, his passing was less a tragedy and more of a high society debut, a strategic move on a social chessboard. I looked down at our joined hands. My knuckles were white, my grip firm. Silence isn't always a lack of words. Sometimes it's a fortress. I've learned that wealth is merely what you have, but dignity is who you are when everything else is stripped away. My grandfather taught me that. He was the one who restored the old oak desk with me, teaching me that beauty is found in the grit of the work, not the shine of the polish. The door creaked open, admitting a draft of cold air and the suffocating scent of expensive French perfume. Sante walked in like a cold front. She didn't look at the bed. She didn't look at the man who had given her everything. Her eyes went straight to the heavy iron safe tucked into the corner of the library annex. "Natalie, move," she said, her voice a polished blade, devoid of the grief she would surely perform for the cameras later. "Go find something useful to do. This is for the adults who actually contribute to this family's future." I stood my ground for a heartbeat, my eyes meeting hers. In that reflection, I saw the truth. She didn't see a daughter. She saw a line item. She saw an obstacle to a balance sheet that needed balancing. I realized then that you cannot wake someone who is pretending to be asleep. I didn't argue. I didn't plead for a moment of shared sorrow. I simply stood, smoothed my skirts, and walked toward the door with a spine made of iron. As I stepped into the hallway, I caught Valora's eye. She was leaning against the wainscoting, checking her reflection in a silver-framed mirror. "Restructuring," I heard Sante whisper to her as the door began to close. "The estate needs a firm hand, not a sentimental one." The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a blueprint. I leaned against the cold wallpaper of the corridor, listening to the frantic clicking of the safe's dial. Sante was trying combinations while her father was still breathing. It's a heavy realization to acknowledge that forgiveness doesn't mean allowing someone to continue hurting you. It means recognizing they no longer have the power to define your worth. I wasn't the accident they made me feel like. I was the witness. Have you ever looked at the people who raised you and realized you were the only adult in the room? Many of us spend our lives waiting for a seat at a table that was never built for us. A sudden silence fell over the room behind me. The heart monitor's rhythmic beep stretched into a single flat tone. The air in the hallway seemed to vanish. Before Sante could react, I slipped back inside. In a final, inexplicable surge of lucidity, my grandfather's eyes flew open. He ignored Sante, who was standing frozen by the safe, and beckoned me closer. His hand, surprisingly strong for a second, pressed a heavy, antique brass key and a wax-sealed envelope into my palm. His voice was a rasping whisper intended only for my ears. "They will try to erase you, Natalie. Let them. When the world believes you are gone, that is when you will truly be free to lead. Open this only when they declare you dead." His hand went limp. The light left his eyes, but a faint, knowing smile remained on his lips. I didn't wail. I didn't collapse. I reached out and closed his eyes with a tenderness that Sante would never understand. I felt the weight of the key in my pocket. It wasn't just gold. It was the weight of a queen's responsibility to her own life. The silence was shattered as Sante and Valora rushed to the bedside. Sante didn't reach for his hand. She reached for her phone. "Get the lawyers on the line," she snapped at Valora, ignoring me entirely. "We need to file the probate papers before the news hits the press. We need to secure the accounts." I watched her dial, her face a mask of predatory focus. She was calling the attorneys before his body was even cold. I realized the Natalie Sterling they thought they knew, the quiet, compliant girl who took the crumbs of their affection, had just died with him. That wasn't the end of his story, it was just the prelude to mine. I tucked the envelope deeper into my pocket, my face expressionless. A storm was raging outside, but I knew exactly where I could find shelter. 3 months have passed since we laid my grandfather in the frozen earth of Greenwich, and the world has moved on with a terrifying efficiency. Inside the Sterling estate, time doesn't march forward, it stagnates. A biting winter morning has clawed its way across the sky, leaving thick patterns of frost clutching the windows like skeletal fingers. I stood at the glass of my third-floor bedroom, watching the gray light struggle to penetrate the heavy velvet curtains. The line between a family home and a state-sanctioned prison had finally blurred into nothingness. I am confined. My world has been systematically reduced to 4 walls, the sterile scent of lavender bleach, and the distant, hollow echo of Valora's laughter drifting up from the gardens below. In the weeks following the probate court's initial hearings, my health didn't just decline, it plummeted. My body feels perpetually heavy, as if my blood has been replaced with liquid lead. This sickness arrived with suspicious timing, settling into my bones just as the legal battle over my grandfather's will reached its peak. Sante enters my room twice a day, a silhouette of cold maternal apathy. She carries lukewarm broth and a tray of silence. She never speaks of the D-Chook, nor does she look me in the eye. I noticed the new diamond tennis bracelet shimmering on her wrist this morning, a bright, expensive spark bought with emergency withdrawals from the estate. It is a bitter thing to realize you are being treated as a ghost while your heart is still beating. I am being erased in real time, right under the roof where I was born. A bird in a cage still knows the direction of the wind, even if its wings are clipped. I recite my grandfather's final letter from memory every morning, a litany of truth to counteract the fog in my brain. I practice mental math, calculating the interest on the Sterling accounts, ensuring my mind remains sharper than the walls closing in on me. They want me weak. They want me quiet. But silence is a weapon when used correctly, and I am learning to sharpen mine. The heavy thud of footsteps in the hallway signaled an arrival I hadn't prepared for. Vance entered the room, his face wearing that practiced mask of brotherly concern that never quite reached his predatory eyes. Behind him followed a man I had never seen. A man in a white coat with eyes that darted nervously toward the museum-grade artwork lining the corridor. There was no talk of the local hospital or a second opinion from the specialist who knew my history. Vance spoke about family privacy and dignity as if they were holy relics, using them as a shield to keep me away from state-mandated medical reporting. Sante followed them in, her pen hovering over a private home care agreement. It was a legally precarious move, a maneuver to bypass the local hospital board, but it was shielded by Vance's intricate understanding of private conservatorship loopholes in Connecticut law. They weren't hiring a doctor, they were commissioning a jailer. I watched Dr. Holloway's hands as he opened his leather bag. They trembled slightly. I saw him lean toward Vance, their voices dropping into a frantic whisper about a debt that needed settling. The air in the room grew thick with the heavy, chemical odor of the syringe he prepared. He called them advanced vitamins, but I knew that smell. It was a high-potency sedative, a chemical tether designed to keep me in a perpetual state of twilight, unable to protest, unable to speak, unable to be Natalie. Evil doesn't always arrive in the dark with a snarl. Sometimes it wears a stethoscope and speaks in the soothing tones of a medical professional. As the needle approached my skin, I didn't scream. I didn't plead. I simply watched Holloway's face, memorizing the sweat on his brow and the specific twitch of his jaw. I let the needle sink in, feeling the cold rush of the drug entering my system, but my mind remained a fortress they couldn't yet breach. Under the suffocating fog of the medication, I developed a survival tactic born of necessity. I learned to hide the pills they gave me under my tongue, a small act of rebellion that required every ounce of my willpower. I would induce vomiting the moment the door clicked shut, retaining just enough of my senses to stay alert while appearing comatose to my captors. It was a dangerous game, a dance on the edge of a blade, but it was the only way to remain a witness to my own life. Valora visited me later that evening, her presence a whirlwind of silk and shallow vanity. She didn't come to comfort me. She came to brag about her upcoming wedding to Vance, a gala event they planned to fund using the unused medical trust my grandfather had set aside for my care. Her cruelty wasn't grand, it was petty and sharp. "It's a mercy, really, Natalie," she whispered, leaning over my bed. "You were always too weak for the Sterling name. Now, you can just fade away in luxury while we do the heavy lifting." I felt a profound, stoic pity for my sister in that moment. I realized that while my body was trapped in this room, Valora's soul was enslaved to a greed that would never be satisfied. The most expensive prison in the world is the one we build out of our own desires. I didn't answer her. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a tear. I simply waited until she left, the silence of the room returning like an old friend. I reached into the hidden slit I had carved into the underside of the mattress, my fingers brushing against the cold, antique brass of the grandfather's key. The weight of it was an anchor, a physical reminder that I was still here. I wasn't waiting to die. I wasn't a victim of their calibrated neglect. I was a Sterling daughter, and they had forgotten that a Sterling doesn't break. We transform under pressure. As the hallway lights dimmed, the shadows in my room lengthened, stretching across the floor like dark water. I strained to hear the voices coming from the library next door. Sante and Vance were arguing, their tones rising with a desperate edge. They were discussing the final signature, the legal document that would declare me permanently incompetent and hand the keys to the kingdom to the very people who were trying to bury me. Have you ever sat in the dark and realized that the people who share your blood are the ones most likely to spill it? It's a moment that changes the chemistry of your heart. The ink was already dry in their minds, but they forgot that a cornered heart is the most dangerous thing in a house built on lies. I looked at the ceiling, my breathing shallow but rhythmic. They think they are writing my obituary, but they are only writing the first chapter of their own downfall. That is the one variable they couldn't account for in their perfect, poisonous math. Midnight in Greenwich carries a different kind of silence. It is heavy, airless, and thick with the scent of old money and fresh betrayals. I lay perfectly still in my bed, my breathing shallow and rhythmic, feigning the drug-induced stupor that had become my daily mask. Through my half-closed lids, the room was a gallery of shadows, illuminated only by the harsh, blue glow of a laptop screen sitting on my nightstand. Sante and Vance were hunched over the screen, their faces skeletal in the artificial light. They weren't checking my vitals. They were reviewing a death certificate. I watched the steady movement of Vance's fingers on the trackpad as he scrolled through a pre-dated obituary for Natalie Sterling. The text claimed I had succumbed to a rare, sudden respiratory failure, a tidy ending for a daughter who had become a logistical nightmare. "The notary is already taken care of," Vance whispered, his voice smooth and devoid of any tremor. "Once the doctor signs the declaration tomorrow morning, the probate trigger activates. I've already moved the funds from her medical trust to cover the margin calls on the Palo Alto project. The grandfather's primary accounts will follow within 48 hours. I watched Sante's expression. There was no grief, no hesitation. She nodded, her mind already calculating the social optics of a funeral. For her, this wasn't about hatred. It was a cold, mathematical equation. She was balancing the ledger of the Sterling family's social survival against my very heartbeat. It is a chilling thing to realize your own mother has priced your existence and found it lacking. The most painful part wasn't the theft of the money. It was the casual erasure of my life. I stared at the red notary seal on the digital document, a small circle of crimson that felt like a target on my chest. I thought of my grandfather's words about dignity. Dignity is a quiet flame. It doesn't need an audience to burn. I wasn't going to scream. I was going to wait. Good, Sante said, closing the laptop. Make sure the flowers are lilies. Natalie always liked things that looked pure and fragile. They left the room, the click of the door sounding like the final turn of a key in a lock. The moment the hallway lights vanished, I sat up. The leaden feeling in my limbs was a lie I had carefully maintained. I reached into the hidden lining of my grandfather's antique wingback chair and retrieved the burner flip phone. My hands didn't shake. I typed a single word to Bancroft. Now. Have you ever had to choose between the life you were given and the life you had to steal back? It's a terrifying crossroads, but standing still is just a slower way to die. Within 20 minutes, a private ambulance pulled into the service entrance, its lights dark. Bancroft didn't arrive as a lawyer. He arrived as the executor of a truth that Sante couldn't buy. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent 40 years navigating the shadows of the law. He wasn't alone. 2 orderlies carried a medical-grade wax and silicone proxy, weighted with heavy stones to mimic the density of a human body. We moved in a breathless sequence of stealth. I watched them arrange the proxy under my covers, tucking the silk sheets around its artificial neck. It was my double, a silent, cold version of the girl Sante wanted me to be. As I was wheeled toward the service elevator, I looked back at the grand, dark mansion. The Sterling estate had been my gilded cage, a place where I was meant to fade away quietly. The price of freedom is often a version of ourselves we must leave behind, I whispered to Bancroft as the ambulance doors hissed shut. I wasn't angry. Anger is a fire that consumes the vessel. I needed to be ice. I told Bancroft I didn't want revenge in the way Sante would understand it. I didn't want to hurt them. I wanted to disqualify them. I wanted the Sterling name to mean something honorable again, even if I had to burn the current house down to clear the ground. Bancroft whisked me across the state line to a secure private clinic in New York, a place where Sante's influence ended at the front gate. The transition was jarring. From the suffocating luxury of Greenwich to the sterile, bright hope of a real medical facility, for the first time in months, I wasn't a case or a disappointment. I was a patient. The real medical evaluation began immediately. The doctors didn't see a psychotic break. They saw a toxicological map of high-dose sedatives. Every milligram was documented. Every chemical trace recorded into a legal file that Bancroft handled like a loaded weapon. As the poison began to leave my veins, my mind cleared. The fog lifted, revealing the sharp, analytical edge I had inherited from the man who built this empire. I spent my nights in that clinic studying the financial records Bancroft had spent years gathering. I tracked the trail of Vance's desperate thefts and Sante's cold complicity. I wasn't just recovering my health, I was preparing for a grand performance. I didn't need a gun or a scandal, I needed the irrevocable weight of facts. True power isn't about who shouts the loudest, I told Bancroft one evening as we reviewed the probate loopholes. It's about who holds the truth when everyone else is shouting lies. I felt the antique brass key in my pocket. It was a constant physical reminder of the grandfather who had seen this coming. He hadn't just left me money, he had left me the tools to survive my own family. I realized then that kindness isn't a weakness, it's a strategic advantage. They underestimated me because they thought my heart made me soft. They forgot that a heart is a muscle, and mine had been trained by the best. 48 hours before the scheduled event, Bancroft entered my room with a copy of the local Greenwich paper. The headline was small but elegant. Tragedy at Sterling Estate. Beloved daughter Natalie Sterling passes away peacefully. Beneath it, a date was set for a chapel service at St. Jude's. I looked at the photo they had chosen, a picture of me from 3 years ago, looking young, vibrant, and blissfully unaware. Sante had chosen it to elicit the maximum amount of sympathy. I ran my thumb over the grain of the paper. "It's a beautiful obituary," I said, my voice steady. "It's a shame I'm not going to be there to hear the eulogy." Bancroft offered a rare, grim smile. "Oh, you'll be there, Natalie, but not in the way they expect." The stage was set for my final exit. They had spent weeks preparing for my burial, but they didn't realize I was the one who had written the ending. I was no longer the invisible heiress. I was the architect of a shadow, and in 2 days, the light was going to find everyone. The morning of my burial arrived with a stark, cruel sun that felt inappropriately bright for a day of mourning. St. Jude's mortuary and chapel sat perched on the edge of Greenwich like a monument to expensive grief. I watched the arrival of the black town cars from the shadows of the organ loft, my heart beating with a steady, clinical rhythm. The masquerade had begun. Below me, the chapel was a curated sea of white lilies and polished mahogany, a masterpiece of staged sorrow. Sante stood at the entrance, a silhouette of tragic elegance in a veil of black Italian lace. She greeted the elite of Connecticut, accepting their condolences like trophies, her voice a soft, practiced tremor. She was reinforcing the narrative they all wanted to believe, the story of the fragile, sickly Natalie Sterling who had finally found peace. I watched her through the wooden slats of the balcony, feeling a strange, detached pity. You cannot wake someone who is pretending to be asleep, and my mother was deep in a dream of her own making. At the podium, Sante delivered a eulogy that was a masterclass in gaslighting. She spoke of late nights by my bedside and the unbreakable bond of a mother's love, painting herself as a tireless martyr, while my actual body, the living, breathing version of me, stood 10 feet above her head. She transitioned seamlessly from the spiritual to the administrative, inviting the notary and Bancroft to the front. She believed Bancroft was compliant, a mere witness to the formal declaration of my passing that would reassign my grandfather's entire estate to Valora and Vance. Looking down at the sea of black and white, I felt the air grow thin. Everyone was perfectly ordered, waiting for the gavel of the law to fall on a foundation of lies. I thought about the many times I had been silenced in that house, told that my voice didn't carry the weight of the Sterling name. Have you ever stood in a room full of people who claim to love you, only to realize they are celebrating your absence? It is a silence that rings louder than any bell. Just as Vance stepped forward, his pen hovering over the probate transfer documents with an almost tactile greed, I gave Bancroft the signal. I moved toward the stairs. The heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel were thrown open by Bancroft's associates, letting in a flood of blinding natural light that sliced through the dim, incense-heavy air. I walked down the center aisle. I wasn't wearing the mourning black of a ghost. I wore a silk dress of defiant blood red, the color of a heart that refused to stop beating. The gasp that rippled through the pews was a physical thing, a collective intake of breath that shattered Sante's carefully constructed theater. I didn't scream. I didn't accuse. I walked with a stoic, terrifying grace directly toward the open casket. I reached the front and placed a single living rose on the lid, resting it right on top of the stones and wax they thought was my corpse. I turned and looked Sante directly in the eyes, my gaze unblinking. "I'm sorry to interrupt the celebration of my demise, Mother," I said. My voice was steady, echoing through the high rafters with a clarity that silenced the room. But as Mark Twain famously said, the reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated. I turned to the guests, my posture radiating the intelligence they had spent 17 years trying to suppress. Sante's mask of grief didn't just slip, it evaporated, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The camera of public opinion was rolling, and for the first time, she wasn't the one directing the scene. The guests leaned in, their faces a mixture of horror and morbid fascination as they realized the corpse in the mahogany box was nothing but a prop. Before Vance or Sante could recover to claim I was an imposter or a medical hallucination, I nodded to Bancroft. Instead of a closing hymn, the chapel's high-fidelity sound system erupted with a crystal-clear recording. It was the audio I had captured from my deathbed. Sante and Valora's voices, casual and cold, debating the cost of this very service. "Make it look expensive, Sante," Valora's recorded voice rang out, stripped of its sweetness. "We need the sympathy to mask the transfer. 10,000 for a funeral is a small price to pay for 10 million in the bank." Then came Sante's voice, laughing softly about how easy it was to dispose of her own flesh and blood once the right doctor was on the payroll. The public humiliation was absolute. In the eyes of the law, and more importantly, in the eyes of the high society they worshipped, Sante and Valora were no longer mourners. They were predators. I stood amidst the wreckage of their reputation, feeling no joy in their fall, only the lightness of a burden finally dropped. True peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of truth. I handed the stunned notary the legal file that Bancroft had prepared, a thick stack of medical records and financial audits proving the fraud irrefutable. I had successfully defended my grandfather's legacy from the vultures, the greedy ones, by showing the world exactly what they were. Many of you watching this might wonder why I didn't just run away. But when you spend your life being erased, sometimes you have to stand in the middle of your own funeral just to prove you exist. Sante, backed into the corner of the altar, suddenly snapped. The grace she had cultivated for decades vanished, leaving only a raw, jagged desperation. She didn't apologize. She didn't weep for her daughter's survival. She pointed a trembling finger at me and shrieked, her voice cracking like dry wood. "You think you've won? You're a mentally unstable girl who just staged her own death. You'll be in a psychiatric ward before the sun sets, Natalie. I'll have you committed." Her desperate scream echoed against the marble, but she didn't see the police officers moving in from the side entrances. She didn't realize that a cornered snake is most dangerous just before it loses its venom, and I had already drawn its fangs. I looked at her, not with hatred, but with a final, exhausted clarity. She was still trying to write my story, but she had run out of ink. I stood in the center of St. Jude's Chapel, the silk of my red dress feeling like a secondary skin, vibrant and warm against the icy draft of the sanctuary. The sun was high outside, streaming through the stained glass and mocking ribbons of color. But inside the vestry, the atmosphere was freezing. Sante's face was no longer a mask of grief. It was a jagged landscape of panic and fury. She pivoted with a speed that only a life of social survival could cultivate. Turning to the stunned crowd and the local officers who had materialized at the doors, she let out a sob that sounded more like a bark. "Don't listen to her. Can't you see? My poor Natalie has lost her mind. The terminal illness, the medications, they've induced a psychotic break." She clutched her throat, her eyes darting like trapped birds. "This whole performance is a tragic symptom of her medical delusions. She needs to be protected from herself." Vance stepped forward, a silver tablet already in his hand, his thumb swiping through documents with a predatory precision. "We have the files right here," he announced, his voice projecting a fake, lawyerly calm. "This is a pre-signed psychiatric evaluation from her attending physician, Dr. Holloway. It clearly states Natalie Sterling is a danger to her own legal standing. We are invoking a 72-hour mental health hold under Section 17A 502. Officers, please, take her for her own safety." I remained unmoved by the chaos swirling around me. My silence was a sharp, focused contrast to Sante's frantic hysteria. I watched them scramble to rebuild the walls of my prison, their lies stacking up like dry kindling. A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes, but once the truth arrives, it never leaves. I wasn't the broken child they wanted the world to see. I was the witness they couldn't silence. How many times have we seen people try to use concern as a cage? It's the oldest trick in the book, especially when the stakes are as high as $10 million. As the police officers hesitated, looking between the legal documents and the composed woman in the red dress, the air in the room shifted. Valora, my sister, stood frozen by the pulpit. I saw the moment the realization hit her. The moment she understood that Sante's reckless, public lying was going to invite a level of police scrutiny that would expose everything. The fraud, the forgery, the medical neglect. She looked at our mother, and then she looked at the handcuffs on the lead officer's belt. In a desperate bid for her own survival, Valora reached into the designer handbag she had carried as a mourning accessory. She didn't pull out a tissue. She pulled out a small, clear evidence bag containing the actual vials of high-dose sedatives, the ones Sante had forced Dr. Holloway to administer in secret. "She's lying!" Valora shrieked, her voice thin and sharp. "It was all Sante! She made me help her! She told me we had to quiet Natalie so we could save the family business!" The chapel went silent, a heavy, suffocating quiet. Valora held up the vials, her hands shaking. "I have the recording too. Sante instructing me on how to dispose of the medical waste after the funeral. I'll give it all to you, just don't take me. Mother, I want 50% of the estate. Right now. Sign it over, or I give them the recording of the intentional poisoning." It was a predator's civil war, played out on the altar of our family's reputation. The sight of her own daughters, one she had tried to erase and the other who was now a traitor, shattered the last of Sante's regal composure. The perfect Sterling family dissolved into a gutter-level screaming match. Sante lunged toward Valora, her fingers clawing at the air, as mutual accusations of murder and theft filled the sacred space. I watched them tear each other apart with a profound sense of sadness. There was no joy in this vindication, only a weary disappointment. I realized that hate is a heavy burden, but the lack of love is a hollow grave. They were fighting over the bones of a legacy that they had already turned to ash. I stood there, Natalie Sterling, a woman whose name they had tried to turn into a death certificate, and I felt nothing but a quiet, stoic distance. Bancroft stepped forward then, accompanied by the local district attorney. He had been a shadow in the back of the room, but now he was the mountain. The physical evidence Valora had produced, combined with the real hospital records Bancroft had secured in New York, created an airtight case. Attempted manslaughter, first-degree fraud, conspiracy. The legal architecture Sante and Vance had built was collapsing in on itself. I walked over to Valora. She was weeping now, a messy, selfish kind of grief. I looked at her, and for a second, I saw the little girl who used to play in the garden with me, before she learned to value pearls over people. "I would have shared everything with you, Valora," I said, my voice soft but final. "I didn't need the millions. I just needed a sister. But you traded a seat at my table for a prison cell." Despite the cruelty they had shown me, I turned to Bancroft. "Ensure they have adequate legal representation," I instructed him. "I will not descend to their level of malice. My grandfather would not want us to become the monsters we fought." I was choosing the path of high-stakes dignity, not because they deserved it, but because I did. To be truly free, you must first forgive yourself for being the target of people who cannot love. As the officers moved in to lead Sante and Valora away, the crowd in the pews began to disperse, their whispers a low hum of scandal that would haunt the Sterling name for decades. Sante wouldn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her shoulders slumped, her spirit finally broken by the one person she thought she had mastered. Just as the handcuffs were clicked onto Vance's wrists, he stopped. He leaned in close, a jagged, ugly sneer twisting his face. He didn't look defeated. He looked like a man who had one last card to play. "You think you've saved the estate, Natalie? You think you're the big winner?" He laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Check your grandfather's safe haven accounts, the ones meant for your future. They're empty. I moved every cent to a shell company in the Caymans an hour before this service started. You won a house, but you're broke." That victory was like dust in my mouth. I stood there, watching them lead away the man I used to call my brother-in-law, the knife still hidden in his sleeve. I looked at Bancroft, his face pale. The house had been rigged, but the foundation was gone. Outside the tall, arched windows of the library, the Connecticut sky was bruised with deep purples and jagged oranges, a violent end to a day that had already shattered everything I knew about my kin. Yellow police tape now stretched across the grand limestone entrance of the Sterling estate, fluttering in the wind like a warning to anyone who believed that money could buy a clean conscience. We moved from the chapel back to the estate's library, the air thick with the scent of old leather and the metallic tang of fear. Bancroft produced Dr. Holloway from a separate room. The man who had walked into my bedroom weeks ago with such clinical arrogance was now a hollow shell. His shoulders slumped, his white coat was wrinkled, and his eyes remained fixed on the Persian rug as if searching for a way to disappear. He wasn't just losing his license tonight, he was staring down a prison sentence for racketeering and attempted manslaughter. Bancroft set a digital recorder on the mahogany table. The click of the record button sounded like a gavel. Holloway began to speak, his voice a monotonous drone of a man who had finally run out of exits. He detailed every bribe Vance had offered and every veiled threat Sante had made. He admitted that the high-dose sedatives were never for my comfort. They were designed to mask my recovery and eventually induce an accidental cardiac arrest. It was a cold-blooded medical execution, timed to coincide with a probate hearing. I sat in my grandfather's chair, listening to the mechanics of my own planned murder without flinching. My hands were folded in my lap, my face a mask of stoic calm that masked the deep ache in my chest. I looked at Sante, who sat across from me, and felt a profound, weary clarity. "You didn't just want the money, Sante," I said, my voice barely above a whisper but filling the quiet room. "You wanted to kill the only part of this family that still had a soul." Vance let out a sharp, jagged laugh, his hands still in cuffs. He leaned back, a sneer twisting his features as he looked at the police officers. "So you have a recording," he spat. "So we go to court. You think you've saved the kingdom, Natalie? Check the safe haven accounts. The offshore transfers to the Caymans were authorized an hour ago, using your digital signature from the death certificate. You won a house, but you're sitting in a dry well. The sterling fortune is gone." Bancroft didn't look up from his briefcase. He simply reached in and pulled out a thick, wax-sealed folder that had been kept in a private Swiss vault. "The smartest person in the room is often the one who isn't there anymore, Vance," I said, repeating a phrase my grandfather loved. Vance's smirk faltered. Bancroft opened the folder, revealing the conditional legacy clause, a legal safety valve my grandfather had engineered years ago specifically to protect me from the people in this room. Under the Slayer rule and bad faith doctrines of U.S. trust law, the clause stated that if any heir attempted to physically harm or legally defraud the primary beneficiary, every sterling asset would be immediately frozen. My grandfather hadn't just trusted a lawyer, he had trusted technology. He had established a biometric trigger with a security firm. Because my pulse and activity data had vanished for 48 hours without a certified hospital admission, a worldwide freeze had been enacted on every sterling account before Vance even opened his laptop. Vance's offshore transfer didn't go to the Caymans. It hit a wall of frozen code and was redirected into an unrecoverable escrow account managed by a nonprofit animal sanctuary, exactly as the grandfather had instructed. I watched the color drain from Vance's face, leaving him a sickly gray. He had stolen exactly $0. He had traded his freedom for a handful of digital dust. I felt a surge of gratitude for the old man who had loved me enough to see through the greed of his own house. The police officers moved in to lead them away. Valora became hysterical, her screams echoing through the high-ceilinged room as she claimed she was forced into the plan. Sante, however, remained eerily silent. Her pride was a suit of armor that refused to let her beg, even as the cold reality of her downfall set in. She walked with a stiff back, her eyes staring at a future that no longer included the sterling name or the sterling fortune. I stopped the officers at the door. "One moment," I said. I stepped toward Sante. I didn't yell and I didn't gloat. Instead, I reached out and adjusted the heavy wool coat on her shoulders, tucking the collar to protect her neck from the evening air. It was a gesture of pure stoic grace, a final act of daughterly care that seemed to unnerve Sante more than any scream of rage could have. She flinched, as if I had burned her with a hot iron. "I am not doing this because I hate you," I told her, my voice clear and steady. "I am doing this because I love the truth more than I love the lie of this family. I will ensure you have a fair trial and a competent lawyer, but I will not pay for your silence or your luxury anymore." I stepped back, letting the officers continue their march. I watched the red and blue lights of the cruisers flicker against the white stone of the driveway until they disappeared into the darkness. For the first time in 17 years, the air inside this house felt clean. The suffocating weight of pretense had been lifted. I thought about a quote my grandfather used to recite when the business world got ugly. Character is doing the right thing when nobody is looking, but destiny is what happens when everyone finally sees. I looked around the library, no longer a prisoner, but the custodian of a legacy that had finally been redeemed. Bancroft approached me as the last member of the forensic team was packing up his belongings. He held a small, old leather box that looked older than the house itself. "We found this in the safe that Sante couldn't open," he said, his voice low and respectful. "This wasn't in the will, Natalie. There's a note attached saying it's only for you to see when the house is empty and the air is fresh again." I trembled as I held the box, feeling as if it were alive. The soft leather, caressed by my grandfather for decades, held a secret. The man who had saved my life from the brink of death still had one last secret he wanted to share, one last lesson he wanted to teach me about the true meaning of bearing the name Sterling. I sat in the quiet, stripped library of the Sterling estate, clutching the weathered leather box. 1 week has passed since the funeral that became my resurrection. Outside, a quiet, clear dawn is breaking over the Greenwich horizon, and for the first time in 17 years, the air inside these walls finally feels light. The oppressive scent of lavender bleach and old lies has evaporated, leaving behind a stillness that is no longer a cage, but a sanctuary. Sante entered the room. She is out on bail, her regal poise replaced by a jagged, frantic desperation. She looked around the empty shelves and then at me, attempting one last, hollow manipulation. "You have to understand, Natalie," she said, her voice a fragile reed. "Everything I did, the papers, the doctor, it was for the family's protection. Vance had gambling debts that would have swallowed us whole. I was just trying to consolidate the power to keep us afloat." I looked at her, and I didn't feel the old, familiar sting of rejection. I felt a stoic, weary grace. "Love is not a transaction, Sante," I told her, my voice steady and low. "And you cannot protect a family by destroying its heart. You didn't choose survival. You chose a lifestyle over your own child." She opened her mouth to argue, but the sound of heavy tires on the gravel driveway silenced her. The bank's legal representatives arrived at the front door precisely at 8 a.m. Because I had been legally deceased for 3 days, the life insurance policies and the massive credit lines Vance had used as collateral were either voided or triggered for immediate repayment. Without my living pulse to verify the Sterling Trust, the entire financial house of cards collapsed. The estate was now in total foreclosure. I watched Sante and Valora's faces as the lead agent handed them the notice. The very house they had sold my life for was being repossessed by the state and the creditors. Have you ever seen the moment someone realizes they've traded everything for a handful of ash? It's a silence that carries the weight of a lifetime of wrong choices. Bancroft stepped forward then, moving with a calm authority that Sante had always tried to suppress. He produced a final set of deeds, notarized and irrevocable. Using the safety valve funds, the money that had been automatically diverted the moment Vance attempted his offshore theft, I had legally purchased the bank's debt and the title to the Sterling estate in its entirety. The power inversion was absolute. I was no longer the sickly daughter hiding on the 3rd floor. I was the sole owner of the house, the land, and the Sterling name. Technically, Sante and Valora were now trespassers in the home they once ruled with such calculated cruelty. Valora began to weep, a shrill, panicked sound. But I didn't order the guards to remove them. Instead, I exhibited a stoic humanitarianism that I knew would confuse them more than any revenge. I offered them the chance to stay in the modest staff quarters at the rear of the property, provided they followed a structured plan to repay their debts to the estate. True victory is not to be like those who hurt you. It is to remain whole while they fall apart. I was providing them with a future they never gave me, choosing a legacy of mercy over the cycle of blood and revenge. I watched them walk toward the back of the house, their designer heels clicking hollowly on the hardwood. I didn't feel like I had won a war. I felt like I had finally closed a book that had been written in a language I no longer spoke. I finally turned my attention to the leather box. Inside, resting on a bed of faded silk, was the last letter from my grandfather. His handwriting was elegant, even as it strayed toward the edges of the page. He revealed that he had known the funeral would be the catalyst for my freedom. He had designed the trap not to punish, but to reveal. "This funeral was never for you, Natalie," the letter explained. "It was to bury the invisible child they forced you to be, so the woman you were meant to be could finally breathe. A sterling daughter does not wait for the storm to pass. She learns to rule the rain. You are not an accident, my dear. You are the architect." I walked out onto the balcony, the same one where I used to hide and watch the world go by without me. The Greenwich sun was warm on my face, and the vast green horizon felt like an invitation. I wasn't just a survivor of cancer or a survivor of a toxic family. I was the author of the next chapter. The antique brass key in my pocket didn't just open a safe. It opened the door to a life where I was finally seen. I stood there for a long time, watching the sunrise over the vast land. I was no longer afraid of the silence. It was no longer the silence of being ignored. It was the silence of a queen ruling a kingdom of peace. I looked at the key in my hand, knowing that the funeral of my past was the birth of a future they could never take away. They say blood is thicker than water, but sometimes it's the very thing that drowns you. I've learned that my value isn't a math problem for others to solve. It's a truth I define for myself. Choosing to survive and choosing peace over petty revenge was my greatest victory. Have you ever had to walk away from someone who shared your blood just to find your own soul? Tell me your story in the comments. I'm reading every one of them.